Well, friends of Jesus, if you're at all acquainted with the challenges that Christians faced in Europe during World War II, you probably know the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. At a time when many Germans were simply willing to go along with the demands of the German government, Bonhoeffer insisted that for Christians, for followers of Jesus, discipleship had a cost. In one of his books, he wrote, "When Jesus calls a person, he bids that person come and die." Pretty sobering words. And Bonhoeffer was somebody who took that call seriously. In the summer before World War II broke out, he had been given a scholarship to come and study in the United States, and many of his friends, knowing that he opposed what was going on with the German government, urged him to stay in the United States where it was safe. But Bonhoeffer couldn't quite live with himself over that choice, and so he decided, just 6 weeks or so before World War II started, that he would go back to his home country to live through whatever his fellow countrymen were going to live through in order to serve the Lord there. And Bonhoeffer paid with his life for his choice. He opposed Hitler during the war, was eventually arrested for it, and just a month before the end of World War II was put to death on Hitler's orders in a concentration camp for his role in opposing the Nazi government. Discipleship has a cost. And so it may seem strange then this morning to speak of the simplicity of following Jesus. And yet when we look at the story of Matthew this morning in the Bible, it almost seems like it really is that simple. Follow me, Jesus had said to Matthew, and that's exactly what happened. Jesus said the words and Matthew followed. And it's so simple, in fact, that maybe it makes us scratch our heads a little bit and say, was Bonhoeffer wrong? Is the cost of discipleship really lower than we think? Is it really so easy to follow Jesus that anyone can do it? Now let me say first of all that I don't think Bonhoeffer was wrong. Discipleship does have a high cost, as Bonhoeffer's own life demonstrates, in the life of many other followers of Jesus throughout history. It isn't always an easy thing to follow Jesus, but it is in many ways simple. Follow me. Jesus tells us to get behind him and to go where he's going. You know, sometimes when we think of the Christian life, we think of discipleship, we think the cost lies in what we give up or in the things that we can't have or the fun that we've decided to forego. But Matthew's example indicates that the cost is much simpler. That following Jesus means getting up and going where he's going. And so we see, first of all, that Matthew lives that example by his own life. He had a pretty good job. Tax collectors, it seems, are never out of work. Matthew had contracted for the right to collect taxes, tolls on the goods that were transported through Palestine. These tolls could exceed 10%. Matthew basically got his cut on whatever he could, on how good he was at collecting those things. And maybe we can imagine that Matthew had kind of a posh office overlooking the Sea of Galilee, where the fishing boats and other trades came into Capernaum. And I wonder sometimes what must have been going through Matthew's mind that day when Jesus stopped by. Had he heard Jesus preach somewhere before? Had he been wondering whether there was more to life than collecting taxes? Or did this call kind of come out of the blue like a lightning bolt? Now, some of you I know watch The Chosen, this video series that you can get about the life of Jesus and his disciples, and maybe from that series you have a picture of Matthew's life. Now, I don't think that The Chosen is unfaithful in its presentation, but we have to acknowledge that what it shows is a lot of creative license. We don't really know that much about Matthew or about how this call came to him. All we know is that whatever happened, he didn't seem to have any doubts about what he needed to do when Jesus spoke those words to him. He got up, our text tells us, and followed. I find it intriguing how little soul searching we find in the Gospels on the part of the disciples when Jesus calls them. Matthew and others just simply respond to the call that Jesus gives them. Now, of course, it's possible that this is not the first time Matthew interacted with Jesus and that there was a series of conversations over the course of months or perhaps even a year or more that led Matthew to the point where he said, okay, I can now follow. We just don't know. But what sets him apart from many others in Jesus' day is that he did respond when asked for a commitment. And that's in contrast to the Pharisees and others in Jesus' day. In fact, this whole segment of Matthew's gospel, starting at the end of chapter 7 and going through the end of chapter 9, kind of tells us about this wrestling with what does it mean to follow Jesus. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the crowds had been amazed at Jesus' authority. But even though the demons in Matthew chapter 8 and the waves and even foreigners respond to that authority, Jesus' own people do not. And Matthew's gospel records the tragedy of that reality. In this passage, we find Jesus' own people questioning his credentials as a teacher. And at the end of this section, Matthew 9, they're finally going to decide that Jesus' authority itself must be demonic. We don't have to listen to him. He's on the other team. And so what Matthew does is something that is quite simple, but also quite challenging. He gets up and he goes where Jesus is going. But Matthew's example also shows that we will never follow unless we recognize Jesus as someone who has authority. You know, it would have been easy, I think, for Matthew to sit and make excuses that day. Follow me. Well, wait a minute, Jesus, where are you going? I mean, how long are we going to be gone? And what's it going to cost me? Why should I follow you anyway? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we know how easy it is to ask those kinds of questions. Whether as individuals or as a church, we think about following Jesus, and we have all sorts of things that we want to say, time out, Jesus. Wait a second here. How's that going to change my life? Am I going to be able to live with the consequences of what it means to obey you in this situation? Is there some way that maybe I can get out of it or have kind of a lesser responsibility in terms of my call to follow you? And I think this plays out in a couple of different ways. One is what I imagine would have been Matthew's default, if you'll allow me for a moment, a kind of stereotype of financial people. Financial people are generally people who analyze things and who think carefully about things. They're not going to, fly off the handle with all sorts of risks. You don't make a lot of money on loans that way. People don't repay you. And I find myself in that. I want to know everything that's going to play out, and I want to make sure that a year from now, I'm not going to be unhappy with the decision that I made. And I think on the other end of the spectrum, there are free spirits. And maybe the challenge there is one more of, it's a fear of missing out. FOMO, right? Well, if I lock myself into this, if I'm following Jesus, then what other things might I not be able to do? And I think both as individuals and as churches, sometimes we struggle between these two poles. And so it's hard to see the joy of just going where Jesus is going. And yet Jesus tells us it's that simple. Just get up and follow. But that brings us to our second thing that we see in the story of Matthew this morning, and that is that the first thing Matthew does when he leaves everything to follow Jesus is to throw a party. And I find this intriguing too, because I don't think that partying for Jesus is really in much of our DNA. It's not in mine, it's not in a church like this one or the Christian Reformed Church that we grew up in. I imagine for many of you, that's not the way that we think about following Jesus. There's tasks and there's responsibilities, but is it joy? And see, Matthew here had made a big commitment. He walked away from everything he knew, but instead of sitting there and pondering and wondering, his response is one of thanksgiving and celebration. And he didn't want to just let a few people in on the change that he had made. Our text tells us that many people came to celebrate with him, enough for the religious leaders to start asking a few questions about what it meant to be a disciple of Jesus. What kind of people is this Jesus calling, they want to know. Now, in some ways, they asked a question that they already had an answer to. It was tax collectors and sinners. Now, tax collectors, we can probably understand, right? They were despised because they did an unpleasant job for a government that was unpopular in Palestine. In fact, in the Jewish mind, tax collectors had done just about everything possible to alienate themselves from God's people, both in the nationalistic sense of that term, but also in the religious sense. They're helping out foreigners. We don't really want them with us. Sinners, as the Pharisees use the word here, describe those that we met in the book of Proverbs a couple of weeks ago, the wicked. Sinners might claim to be a part of God's people, but their lives don't really show that they're interested in being regulated by God's law. They're adulterers, dishonest businessmen, compulsive liars, that sort of people. But they were also those who, in the view of others, failed to take God seriously, and that's why they lived the way they did. And they certainly weren't the kind of people that God wanted around him. So we might ask ourselves, as the Pharisees did, why would Matthew invite these kind of people to a party? Especially now that he had made a decision to follow Jesus, and why would Jesus want these kind of people to follow him? They didn't, after all, seem to be the most likely disciples. But what Matthew realized and what Jesus taught was that being a disciple wasn't first and foremost about what you had done before this moment. Being a disciple is a matter of where you are going now and the spirit in which you are doing it. Like we read earlier from Lord's Day 32, during the time of confession this morning. We do good not to prove our worth or our value in God's sight or prove our worth or value to others. We do good to show by our lives that we belong to Christ and that we are thankful for what he has done for us. See, Matthew had gotten up and followed Jesus. He didn't know yet how it was going to change his life. Early Christian legends report that Matthew later on traveled there's various places that they say he traveled, but that he paid for his life with his preaching. We don't know for sure, but we still catch a glimpse in these moments here of what it meant for Matthew to follow Jesus. He discovered in such a short time the joy and freedom of being welcomed by the Son of God into fellowship with God. And he recognized that he had a lot of friends who were living the wrong sort of life and needed to know that joy and freedom of following Jesus too. See, it's not that the Pharisees were necessarily wrong in labeling Matthew's friends as the kinds of people who hadn't wanted a relationship with God. What they were wrong was in writing them off as a kind of people that God couldn't possibly have any use for. Do we know the joy of following Jesus and inviting others into that? You know, in some ways, what we did yesterday with the bike rodeo was an attempt to make that plain to people around us. To say that following Jesus can give us joy and can give us excitement because it is fun to serve together. Or I talk to people who got a piece of bread and who serve a piece of bread and they'll say, you know what, that was really great. Not so much because I was able to serve our community, but even though I was, but because there was fellowship and being aware of the need to communicate the love of God through our words and our deeds. Why would Jesus want people like Matthew to follow him? I think that's an important question today because tax collectors and sinners aren't the only ones who find it challenging at times to follow Jesus. The Pharisees of Jesus' day found it impossible to follow him. The book of Matthew tells of a rich young man who went away sad, we're told, because he realized that his wealth meant more for him than being Jesus' follower. And I think today, in some ways, maybe people like you and I face the same challenges. Sometimes it's easier to sacrifice something than to follow Christ. To give up an hour on a Sunday morning is an easier thing than to give up 15 minutes to pray. It's easier to put $100 in the offering plate than it is to teach Sunday school or serve on council. Sometimes it's even easier to put all of our time and effort into building relationships and into fellowship than it is to speak the gospel into each other's lives. And yet, those who recognize the wonder of being called to be part of what Jesus is doing. Get excited. When they're given opportunity to invest in that, to pour themselves into that, and to invite others to do the same. The kingdom of God is like a party, Jesus says. And finally, we have an opportunity then to see kind of where the rub lies in all of this. As Jesus answers the question about why he would want people like Matthew to follow him, he points the Pharisees to a word from the prophet Hosea. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now the formula, I want this, not this, doesn't mean instead of, but rather it means I want this more than this other thing. It doesn't mean I don't care about sacrifice, all I want is mercy. Sometimes that's a mistake that churches make or that Christians make. It doesn't matter what the rules are. It doesn't matter what you do. What matters is that you love people. You want the best for them. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. Rather, he's saying these two things go together. And in thinking about sacrifice and in thinking about obedience and in thinking about the law, we can't forget that God is a God of mercy. Think, for example, of kids who tell their children, parents who tell their children not to complain about their food. And maybe they'll say something like this, if you complain about what you have to eat, you're going to get more of it on your plate. Now, kids can be smart. And sometimes they'll think, if I get more of what I complain about, then I'm going to make sure that I complain when mom brings out the cookies. It doesn't work in our family. And it's not because mom is so concerned about the rule of what you say, but it's about the relationship with the one who made the meal. And about a thankfulness for what has been put in front of you. That's how God's law functions. God doesn't want us just to behave. He wants us to enjoy him forever, as the Westminster Catechism puts it. And so Jesus sends the Pharisees away, telling them literally, as you're going through life, learn what this means. As you're walking along, think about how God's mercy comes to play in this situation, even as you're thinking about what God's law says we should or shouldn't do. See, no one appreciates the research that has been done on cancer like those whose lives have been saved by that research. No one appreciates medicine until they have a cold that won't go away without the medicine. If you know the story of the prophet Hosea, he had been commanded by God to marry an unfaithful wife and to keep loving her even after she left him again and again and again. And God told Hosea, this is an example of how he loved his own people. Go and love your wife, he told the prophet, as the Lord loves the Israelites, even though they turn to other gods. And in the same way, we can't understand how to follow Jesus unless we recognize how lost we are without him and our own need for mercy. Jesus didn't hang around sinners because he accepted their sin. He knew that sin was a deadly reality in the lives of many people that he met. He knew that it was a lot easier for the Samaritan woman to come and ask about the proper ways of worship and the right styles of worship than it was to have Jesus challenge her about her patterns of marital unfaithfulness. Jesus knew that it was easier for the rich young man to ask for a checklist of good deeds to do rather than to put God ahead of his lavish lifestyle. And he knows the same about us, about you and about me. He knows that it's easier for us to criticize people's bad behavior from afar, the mistakes that those out there are making, than it is to ask where Jesus is changing your heart and mine, to recognize our need for mercy, and to follow Jesus into the messiness of this world. Jesus knows all that, and still he taps people on the shoulder and says, follow me. And he says to you and me and churches like ours, I know that this balance between mercy and sacrifice, between obedience and grace, is one that you're still learning. It's one of those things that takes a lifetime to figure out, and even then, after we're 70, 80, 90 years old, we don't have it perfectly sorted through. And yet Jesus says, I want you to follow me and walk with me into the messy places of this world. And just do that, praying, trusting that God's wisdom and God's Spirit will help you to be faithful in the next step. Even if you don't have it all planned out, even if you don't know what risks you're taking, even if you don't know what you're going to miss out on. Discipleship has a cost, yes. And that cost may be in what we give up or what we face as we follow, but the cost is not discipleship. The cost itself is not discipleship. Discipleship means simply going and following Jesus, discerning where he's leading, and then saying, I'm going to go that way. We all need Jesus in order to know God. Matthew recognized that. His sinful friends needed Jesus. But you know what? So did the Pharisees. So do those in prison today. So do those in different parts of the world who follow different faiths. But even the saintliest member of this congregation needs Jesus. We all need to see Jesus hanging on the cross in order to remind us how much God loves you and me and this world. And we all need to experience the power of new life in Jesus' resurrection to know the hope and joy that comes from following him. That's why we start with an Easter song today. To remind ourselves where this all goes back to, that this all goes back to one Sunday at an empty tomb. God's grace takes each one of us and says, you are important to God. So important, in fact, that God invites you to get on board with what he is doing in the world. That's the beauty of discipleship. It's simplicity. At its most basic level, Christianity boils down to this. He or she or they, that family, that church, they got up and followed Jesus. And when people looked at them, they said, there's something about that group of people that shows they're part of the same family, right? You know how you can tell sometimes you're like, oh, they walk like they're, they walk like mom and dad did. They stand there. I do this sometimes. Once in a while, I'll catch myself in the mirror and I'm like, I look so much like my father. God wants his people, his church, to have a similar family resemblance to him. Followed where? Where's this all going? We don't know. For several years, obviously, we know that Matthew followed along the dusty roads of first century Palestine. And after the resurrection, when Jesus' church was scattered, maybe he went much further. Maybe Matthew had to follow through some sticky moral or doctrinal issues. But he followed. Now, where is he calling us? Maybe God is calling you to go no farther than Whitensville, Massachusetts, to be invested in this church and its people. Maybe he's calling you to go to your neighbor, or perhaps to a parent, or a son, or a daughter who needs to know, or maybe who needs to know again, the wonder of being tapped on the shoulder by Jesus and saying, I want you. I want you to follow me. Maybe God is calling you to the family business or to the school. Maybe he's calling you to go farther away, to go to seminary perhaps, or to the mission field. Wherever it is, we simply go, learning all the time, watching for ways to see God's mercy in action. We are simply given the command, follow me. It's a command that asks us to examine what direction our lives are taking at this point. Where are we going? What are we following now? Whose authority do we recognize? And have we seen the joy of the way of life that Jesus invites us to? Like Matthew, we face a moment of critical examination, calling for an immediate response. To each of us comes the command and the question, will you follow me? And Jesus wants to know, how will you and I, how will we together respond?